When a politician promises you free money, the first thing you should protect is not your bank account, it's your common sense. You're hearing about this idea of a $2,000 tariff dividend, a kind of bonus check for most Americans, supposedly paid out of tariff revenue. On the surface, it sounds like a windfall. For a lot of people in their 50 seconds, 60 seconds, 70 seconds, $2,000 feels like a month of Social Security, a property tax bill, a medical deductible, or a year's worth of groceries if you really squeeze that. The temptation is to ask, when do I get it? The smarter question is, who really paid for it? Here's the twist most people miss. This isn't Washington finding new money. It's Washington recycling your money through a more painful route. Tariffs are just taxes with better marketing. They're collected at the border, but they land in the prices you pay at the store, in the car dealership, at the pharmacy, and on the utility bill. By the time the government has enough for a $2,000 check, you've already been paying into that pot every week through higher prices, often without realizing it. Think about your last trip to the supermarket. You're standing under harsh white lights, looking at a cart that used to cost $120 and now rings up at $150. Same bread, same milk, same eggs, same brand of coffee. You're not living larger, but the bill is. Behind that checkout screen, there's a quiet line item called policy. You don't see it printed, but it's there in higher input costs, disrupted supply chains, tariff surcharges, and companies passing everything along because they're not charities. That's where tariff revenue is born. Now, imagine Washington taking a victory lap. We've raised nearly $200 billion in tariff revenue. We'll give most citizens a $2,000 dividend. The number sounds impressive until you remember one basic fact. The government doesn't create wealth, it reallocates it. When you hear $200 billion in tariff revenue, translated into plain language, $200 billion in extra cost pushed into the real economy. That's higher prices today, smaller retirement balances tomorrow, and thinner margins for the businesses that might have hired your children or grandchildren. There's another uncomfortable truth here. A one-time $2,000 payment is a headline. Ongoing higher living costs are a slow leak. If you're 65 and you spend the next 15 years in retirement, even an extra $50 or $100 a month in higher prices, compounded over time, eats far more than $2,000. It doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. It feels like choosing cheaper cuts of meat, postponing a dental procedure, buying fewer gifts for the grandkids. That's how economic policy shows up in ordinary lives. Quietly, relentlessly, on the margins. From an investment perspective, the real damage isn't just the check you get or don't get, it's the mindset it encourages. If you're planning a retirement around political checks, stimulus, rebates, dividends funded by new forms of tax, you've already surrendered the most important asset you have, control. You're outsourcing your future to election cycles, to slogans, to negotiators you'll never meet. That's not a retirement plan. That's a lottery ticket with better packaging. The shock to me is how easily sophisticated adults fall for it. You've worked 40, 50 years. You understand there's no free lunch. Yet rebrand a tax increase as a tariff dividend, and suddenly people who know better start asking whether they should spend it or invest it. The right question is whether you want a system that quietly takes from you through higher prices and then asks you to be grateful when a fraction is handed back. Here's one data point worth sitting with. If a program sends $2,000 to, say, 150 million people, that's $300 billion. To sustain that, you either need enormous recurring tariff collections, deeper borrowing, or higher taxes elsewhere. In every case, the bill comes back to the same group: workers, savers, retirees. There is no magical foreign wallet footing that expense. It's all internal, it's all us. Picture a different cinematic frame for a moment. A retiree sits at a small kitchen table, papers spread out, Social Security statement, Medicare premiums, a letter from the county about rising property taxes, a notice from the utility company about new surcharges, and now a news clip on the tablet promising a $2,000 dividend. That check, if it ever arrives, might cover one or two of those envelopes. The others will be waiting the month after and the month after that. Policy that increases your structural costs but hands you a one-time payment is not a gift, It's a temporary bandage on a long-term bleed. If you're between 50 and 70, your real vulnerabilities are already on the table. Required minimum distributions that can push you into higher tax brackets, healthcare expenses that grow faster than your portfolio, inflation that quietly erodes your fixed income, estate rules that can strip control from your family at the worst possible time. None of those core pressures are solved by a single $2,000 check. They're solved, if they're solved, by habits. Disciplined saving, sensible spending, diversified investing, and a tax-aware strategy for how and when you draw down your assets. The harsh reality is this. Every hour you spend hoping for a political check is an hour you're not spending tightening your own plan. In investing, the compounding that matters is not political promises. It's time and discipline. Governments can redistribute money. They cannot manufacture peace of mind. And in retirement, peace of mind is the one dividend you cannot afford to outsource. Once you understand that a $2,000 tariff check is really just recycled money, you have to ask a harder question. What kind of system needs to play these games in the first place? If you're between 50 and 70, your real life is already entangled with three structures you don't control: Social Security, the tax code, and the healthcare system.
The trust funds face pressure in the early 2000s and 30 seconds. The IRS keeps adjusting rules around required minimum distributions, and healthcare costs have been growing faster than wages for most of your working life.
None of that instability is solved by a single check. In fact, policies like high volatile tariffs can make those systems more fragile by slowing growth, shrinking the tax base, and pushing the government toward more short-term fixes funded by more creative taxes. Here's an insight most people never hear from a podium. Every new benefit that's not matched by productive growth is a claim on your future taxes, your future inflation, or your children's future options. Governments only have three tools to pay for promises: tax more, borrow more, or inflate more. Tariffs are a way to do a little bit of all three while pretending it's somebody else's problem. The burden shows up as higher prices now, higher debt service later, and a slower economy in between. For a retiree on a fixed income, that's the worst mix you can ask for. Let's bring this down to the individual level. Say you're 68, already taking Social Security with a modest IRA, or 401. The IRS forces you to start taking distributions at a certain age, whether you need the money that year or not. Those distributions are taxable. If inflation and tariffs have pushed prices higher, you may need to take more out just to live the same life, pushing yourself into a higher bracket. Meanwhile, any tariff dividend check you receive is also likely to be taxable in some form. The result is a strange loop. The same policies that raised your cost of living now raise your tax bill on the money meant to help you keep up. A strong number to anchor to is this. For many households in their mid-60 seconds, healthcare is already the single largest expense in retirement, often exceeding housing. Premiums, deductibles, co-pays, out-of-network surprises, they all respond to the same forces that tariffs and inflation disrupt: supply chains, labor costs, pricing power. When policymakers brag about new revenue from tariffs, what they're really saying is that they've added more stress to the very system that sets the price of your prescriptions and your treatments. It's like bragging about how much extra water you poured into a boat that's already sitting low. Picture a different cinematic image. A man in his early 70 seconds is sitting in a financial advisor's office. On one screen, there's the simple retirement plan they built 10 years ago. Steady withdrawals, modest market returns, predictable expenses. On the other screen is today's reality: higher spending on food and energy, bigger healthcare costs, and a tax projection that jumps sharply when RMDs kick in fully. The advisor clicks a button and adds a hypothetical $2,000 tariff dividend every year. The graph barely moves. The line that really changes is the one showing inflation-adjusted spending. That's the one that decides whether he runs out of money at 83 or 91. The deep problem with policies like this is not just that they're inefficient. It's that they nudge people into the wrong mental framework. They teach you to look up, not inward, to wait, not plan, to hope for a check instead of tightening your budget, paying down high interest debt, and making sure your portfolio is aligned with your actual risk tolerance. I've spent most of my life telling people that markets are there to serve you, not instruct you. The same applies to politics. When political cycles start dictating how you feel about your retirement, you've given away a kind of sovereignty. There's also a generational element that's easy to overlook. Every dollar spent to buy near-term popularity with older voters is a dollar that won't be available for longer-term investments in productivity, infrastructure, education, innovation. Those are the things that make it easier for your children and grandchildren to carry the promises made to you. A tariff-funded dividend is a shortcut. It diverts resources from growth toward optics. For someone already retired, that might feel like someone else's problem. But the value of every dollar you hold is tied to the strength of the system your family inherits. You don't have to like that reality, but you do have to plan around it. That means viewing any political check, whether it's called a stimulus, a rebate, or a dividend, as a windfall, not a foundation. If it comes, you can use it to reinforce your own defenses, build a cash buffer, pay for a necessary repair before it becomes a crisis, or reduce debt that's charging you double-digit interest. But you cannot build a serious retirement on episodic generosity from a government that's already struggling to honor the commitments it has made through Social Security, Medicare, and the tax code. In the end, the choice is simple but uncomfortable. Trust a system that has to keep inventing new labels for taxes and transfers, or trust the boring arithmetic of what you earn, what you save, what you own, and what you spend. One is noisy, dramatic, and makes headlines. The other is quiet, repetitive, and defines whether you sleep well when the cameras are off and the promises fade back into silence. Underneath all the talk about dividends and checks, what matters most at your age is not a headline number, but who really controls the rules around your money. If you're in your 50 seconds, 60 seconds, or 70 seconds, your life is already tied to a web of promises and regulations. The Social Security Administration deciding cost of living adjustments, the IRS updating tax brackets and RMD ages, Medicare changing what it covers and what it doesn't, the Fed pulling interest rates up or down. None of those institutions asked you for permission before they shifted the ground under your feet. They won't ask you before the next change either. That's the shock most people never internalize. The biggest risk to your retirement is often not the market, it's the rule book. One vote, one amendment, one late night deal can rewrite more of your future than a year of stock market volatility. Picture a long, polished table on Capitol Hill at 2 in the morning. A handful of staffers and lawmakers are huddled over draft text for a revenue-neutral adjustment to the tax code. Somewhere in those pages, buried in technical language, is a small change to how retirement accounts are taxed, or how thresholds for Medicare surcharges are calculated. No cameras, no speeches, no campaign music, just quiet edits. Out in the country, millions of people sleep, assuming their plans are intact. By the time they wake up, the math of their estate, their RMDs, their health care costs has shifted by thousands of dollars over the next decade. That's how the game is really played. Here's an insight I wish more retirees heard. A one-time $2,000 payment is irrelevant if your lifetime tax drag rises by $50,000 because of how and when you take income. The IRS doesn't care what label politicians put on the check. It cares how much taxable income shows up on your return each year. If higher prices push you to withdraw more from your IRA, if RMD rules force larger distributions into a compressed time frame, if Medicare premium brackets pull you into higher charges because your modified adjusted gross income crossed a line by a few $100s, that's where the system quietly reclaims far more than any dividend it sends you. This is why I tell people, stop thinking only about what you own and start thinking about how it's taxed over time. Two retirements with the same headline net worth can look completely different once the IRS schedule, the SSA benefit formulas, and Medicare surcharges are applied. A taxable brokerage account, a Roth, a traditional IRA, a paid-off home, even a small business you still own, all of those interact with the code in different ways. If you let policy volatility dictate your withdrawals and your behavior, you become a passenger. If you build a plan that anticipates higher taxes, uneven inflation, and healthcare shocks, you regain some steering. Not all of it, but some. And that some is where real peace lives. Think for a moment about legacy, not in the romantic sense, but in the spreadsheet sense. What do you actually want to leave behind? assets, or uncertainty. I've seen too many families where the estate ends up in probate limbo, or where heirs are forced to liquidate good assets at bad prices to cover tax bills and medical debts. In those stories, the problem wasn't that the market failed. It's that the planning never assumed the rules could turn harsher. A policy sold as asking the wealthy to pay their fair share can sweep in people who simply save diligently in tax-deferred accounts. A tariff policy sold as making other countries pay can end up lowering the real value of the dollars you pass on. Intentions don't pay the bills, mechanics do. There's a cinematic image I keep in my mind. An older couple in their late 70s sits at a wooden table with their adult children. On the table are two folders. One is thick, chaotic, loose statements, old policies, scribbled notes about what Dad wanted, and a few checks from government programs that came and went. The other is thin, organized an estate plan, clear beneficiary designations, a written strategy for how accounts should be drawn down, what should be sold, what should be kept. In one scenario, the family fights the system in confusion. In the other, they navigate it with clarity. The difference was not intelligence. It was whether the parents spent their late 50 seconds and 60 seconds chasing political promises or quietly building a structure that assumed those promises might fail. So where does that leave you with a proposal like a $2,000 tariff dividend? Treat it the way you'd treat a surprise bonus at work. Helpful, but not foundational. If it arrives, you can use it surgically to pay down a high-interest balance, to fund a year's worth of insurance premiums, to build an emergency reserve so you don't have to raid your investments at the worst possible time. But do not let it change your core assumptions. Assume taxes will not get lighter. Assume healthcare will not get cheaper. Assume policies will continue to shift in ways that are hard to predict and harder to reverse. Then build something that can stand anyway. In the end, a calm retirement doesn't come from the size of a single check. It comes from thousands of small, boring decisions made over decades, living a little below your means, avoiding unnecessary debt, owning productive assets, understanding your tax brackets, and refusing to let election season rewrite your life plan every 4 years. Politicians can offer you a dividend funded by tariffs. Markets can offer you a dividend funded by real earnings. One is noisy and short-term. The other grows slowly in the background, year after year, whether the slogans change or not. The only dividend that truly belongs to you is the one created by your own discipline, compounded over time, long after the headlines about tariffs and checks have disappeared into the archives.